During the same time period, I was also writing on Dharma-related issues. And several devotees who liked my writings on that topic asked me to please study the Ritvik Rasa arguments. One wrote and told me that he appreciated the way I was able to reach, in his view, solid conclusions based on logic. He told me that he saw how this allowed me to debate the issue of Dharma, again, this was in his view, in a convincing and non-fanatical way. He didn't even ask me if I had studied the Ritvik Rasa issue yet for myself. Rather, he assumed I had not. And he told me he did so because I was not fully supporting it. I was intrigued by the boldness of his presumption. He was absolutely certain that someone with my intelligence, again, this was his assessment and opinion, would fully accept the Ritvik Rasa path if they were only to study it directly themselves. His presumption was that the only reason I currently didn't fully embrace it was because I hadn't yet dove in and studied it in depth myself. What impressed me was his presumption was correct. I hadn't actually studied the topic yet at that time. Because of where and by the way, notice that he was a Ritvik Rasa supporter, and he could see that I wasn't supporting the issue. But the GBC had already labeled me a Ritvik Vadi and claimed my writing was just in support of Ritvik, so I was just a Ritvik devotee. They had misunderstood. But a Ritvik supporter, he saw I wasn't. Because of where I had already come to on this issue already, and thanks to his encouragement, I saw that I could no longer, put this off. I just no longer had a choice. I had to dive in and do my own due diligence, do my own research on this Ritvik Rasa issue. And so I set out to research to find out which path Srila Prabhupada really wanted us to be on. But again, those same sickening, dark feelings came up. What was it? Every time I sat down to start studying this issue to find out the answers to what system Srila Prabhupada really wanted, to find out if he wanted those 11 Ritvik, if he wanted the 11 Ritviks to have become gurus or not, whether I'm trying to find evidence for this or against it, still these same sickening dark feelings would rise up and just stop me. This time I had to confront it. I had to face the dark side. Really? Am I really going to use an old and worn out Star Wars analogy? Well, yeah, why not if it fits? I had to find out what that darkness was. I had to get past the dark side. I couldn't just push it aside and push it off any longer. I had to deal with it, whatever it was. And the best way for me to describe it is that it felt like there was just this door that led to a very dark room within me. And I began to realize that there was something very bad and dark on the other side of that door. Even though this had been haunting me for so long and for so many years and kept me from researching this topic, it actually took but just a few days of determination to deal with those dark feelings head on. Immediately, I realized it was something connected to a past experience. There was something that I just wasn't able to deal with a long time ago, something that was dark, something that I just wasn't able to confront. And it had been buried deep within me. Something that I had to push down and into some dark closet and shut the door on it. What was it? And it literally felt like I was opening up a door within me. As I opened it, these thoughts and these questions that I had suppressed long ago started rising up. They were the same questions. The questions that I couldn't find answers to many, many years ago. And it was the same questions that I was now going to have to research to find the answers to. When I couldn't find the answers to those questions many years ago, it put me into a very dark and depressed state of mind because I had no way of answering those questions at that time. And I wasn't able to deal with that darkness. So I had to push this whole thing deep within me and shut a door on it. And now, nearly 22 years later, I've finally opened that door back up. Then the questions came. How could Srila Prabhupada have appointed men who were so unfit and unqualified to become the next gurus in our line? The GBC said they had, but if that were true, it shook the very foundation of my faith in Srila Prabhupada, faith in his mercy and shelter, faith in his transcendental knowledge, faith that he was an empowered representative of Krishna. There was no way I could accept that he could have selected such unfit and unqualified men. So why did I have that feeling that they were so unfit and qualified? Because I knew what those men had done. I knew that they had just committed a great offense to Srila Prabhupada. And they had just lied to all of us all over the world using Srila Prabhupada's name. As I opened that door, all of this memory, all of this came back. And I knew at that time, back in 1977, that those men were not fit and qualified. I knew they were no way that Srila Prabhupada could have selected them to become the next acharyas. Yet the GBC was insisting he had. And so at that time, I fell into a dismal darkness, trying to figure this out, trying to come up with answers which I had no way of answering back then. And so the whole ordeal depressed me, and such that my life had come to a very dark end, and I wasn't able to function anymore. The memory of that whole thing just came up in a flash and hit me. And that I finally found that was what all these dark feelings that were coming up every time that I would sit down to study this issue, because in studying this issue, I would again have to face those same questions that I couldn't answer before. The same ones that I had no way to answer that had driven me into that dark depression. If Srila Prabhupada had appointed these men, if Srila Prabhupada had appointed these men, then that meant that he wasn't really that knowledgeable, that he didn't have the understanding to know that they were capable of committing so many offenses. And yet, if he had not appointed them, the only other alternative I could have think of back in 1977 and 78 was that this whole guru issue was nothing but a big fat lie perpetuated by the GBC. And if that were true, then I no longer wanted to be a part of their lies, which mean I would have to leave ISKCON. But that was not an acceptable option for me back then. But then how could I stay and accept these men as being bona fide gurus when I knew they had just lied to us and cheated us, and worse, they had sabotaged Srila Prabhupada's personal request, and in the end, hurt Srila Prabhupada and offended him? How could I accept that what the GBC was telling us, that Srila Prabhupada had selected them as gurus, and how could I accept them as gurus? These were the questions I had no answers to nearly 22 years prior that caused my life to reach that dark, dead end. And so I had to push this whole thing down into a hole and shut a door on it, just so that I could go on with my devotional life. I couldn't face those unanswerable questions 22 years earlier, but now that I opened the door and I again came face to face with them, in early of 1999, I had now the information. I had access to information. And so when those questions came up and came to the day of light, they no longer haunted me like they did back in 1978. I was now able to fully confront them head on and now find the answers to those questions. This also brought the incident of when Rameshwar and Satsvarup had lied to us about Srila Prabhupada's request. It all brought that back up. And it brought it to the full light of the day, the full light of day in my memory. And when it did, I could remember everything as clear as if it had just taken place the week before. It was as if the whole event had been recorded on videotape and put into a vault. And once I opened that door back up and took out the vault and played the video, it was right there. Everything was so clear. The words that Rameshwar spoke to me when I sat down and met with him, it's just as if it was being played back on a video. I could remember the whole thing so clearly. Now, I don't want to get ahead of myself again in this story, but I don't want those watching this presentation to jump to the wrong conclusion. Back in 1977, I couldn't figure out whether the GBC were lying to us about the 11 becoming gurus, or if Srila Prabhupada had made a big blunder and a horrible judgment of character and appointed men who were not at all qualified. Understand that in 1977-78, it wasn't as if it wasn't like I just felt that these men were unfit and unqualified. It wasn't just my personal opinion or view, but I knew for a fact what they had done. I knew that they had lied to all of their godbrothers on a massive scale, and I knew, as Bhardraj had told me, that Srila Prabhupada was very hurt and offended by their actions. So I knew they had committed Guru Aparad. My assessment wasn't based on speculative opinion, nor was it based on enviousness. It was based on the fact that I had direct knowledge of their fallen and offensive actions. Back in 1978, those are the only two scenarios I could think of. That either Srila Prabhupada was not really a bona fide representative of Krishna because he lacked the knowledge and ability to know that those men were not really fit or qualified. Or that the only other thing I could think of is that the GBC had hijacked Srila Prabhupada's mission and were just lying to us about this whole thing about them being appointed gurus. Neither of those scenarios were acceptable to me in 1978. And so that's why I fell into that dark state of mind, trying to figure this out, but had no access to any information to do so. But in 1999, it was early 1999, I realized that there was a third scenario, one which I later found convincing, supporting evidence as to what actually happened. And that was that while Srila Prabhupada did not select these men to become actual gurus, the GBC wasn't knowingly and purposefully lying it to us either. Rather, the GBC had simply misunderstood what they thought Srila Prabhupada actually wanted. It was their lack of proper understanding that what Prabhupada was actually saying on May 28th that caused them to go totally down the wrong path. But as I said, I will deal with all of that in the chronological timeline segment. In 1999, when I first realized what the dark feelings were and remembered what these GBC men had done, the first thing that came to my mind was that the GBC of that day of 1999, when my first thought that came to mind, that they needed to apologize for what the GBC men did back in 1977. Their lies and their actions had hurt and offended Srila Prabhupada. Their actions and lies hurt me and so many of Srila Prabhupada's disciples. The GBC, in my view, had to own up and face this fact. They had to own up to what the GBC members of 1977 had done. So in the early part of 1999, I again wrote another email to the GBC, but this time though, It had nothing to do with the other issues that I've been writing to them about. I told them my experience with the GBC men lying to us in 1977 and how strongly and negatively it had affected me personally back then. I hadn't found the letter yet at that time that was in the database. That I didn't find for another 12 years, but that describes parts of this incident. So I didn't refer to that. All I was telling the GBC, all that I could tell them, was just from my own experiences of what I knew about it and how I had met with Rameshwar and how he had told me all that he had. I asked in a humble way that the GBC of 1999 make a public apology, first to Srila Prabhupada, because he was personally hurt and offended by their actions. And I asked that they apologize directly to all of Srila Prabhupada's disciples for the lies that these men had told us back in 1977. I told them that in my personal opinion, until they do so, they will never be able to properly manage this society. That this was a big black stain on the GBC's past. And the only way to start to remove it was to make these apologies sincerely and publicly. I sent this email probably just after the 1999 GBC meetings. Again, I got the same responses I had been getting for the past 2 years, and that was just nothing but cold, dark silence. No, I guess the lights didn't go out. Not one single member of the GBC had the basic common courtesy to even reply to my email, to this email about them apologizing on behalf of for what the GBC had done in 1977. They lacked the common courtesy to even to reply to any of my emails for nearly 2 years. That Srila Prabhupada would always reply to the letters that were mailed to him, even from an insignificant disciple such as my lowly self. The GBC of 1999 gave neither Srila Prabhupada's disciples nor Srila Prabhupada the public apology he and we all deserved for the offenses that the GBC of 1977 had committed. Of course, many of the members on the GBC in 1999 were members of the GBC in 1977 as well. So maybe these men just didn't feel like it was something they wanted to do. But it is what they had done. And so they should be called out for it, and they should be accountable for what they had done. What they did was serious, and it was wrong. They had offended their own spiritual master, ISKCON's founder Acharya, His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. The GBC had to publicly own up for what they had done. In 1999, it didn't occur to me at that time, but later I realized that knowledge of this event is important for resolving the Ritvik Guru issue because it shows how flawed these men's thinking and judgment was at that time in 1977. But in 1999, I didn't even think about it in that way. In early 1999, 21 years and a half after the actual occurrence, it was the first time that all of this finally resurfaced for me. It was the first time in nearly 22 years that I recalled what really had happened. For me, it was the first time I could really deal with it. Back in 1999, I was just wanting some form of closure on this. And I thought that an apology by these men for what they had done in 1977 would have gone toward that so I could have put this ordeal behind me. But besides apology to the Prabhupada's disciples, they, for themselves, needed to apologize humbly and sincerely to Srila Prabhupada. But the GBC did nothing. So they must have decided that it wasn't a serious thing, that it wasn't a serious thing to offend Srila Prabhupada and hurt his feelings. I mean, what were they thinking? I don't know what they were thinking because they didn't send me any reply. Maybe they thought it was of no importance to apologize to Srila Prabhupada's disciples who were hurt and offended by those actions. In 1999, Tamal Krishna was still living. And I also sent this request directly to his email address. He was directly involved and implicated in this in 1977, and I wrote this and explained this in my email. He also didn't reply to my email. And if he had issues with the way I told what had happened, and he didn't agree with what Rameshwar had told me, then Tamal Krishna had full opportunity to have at least replied to my email and tried to dispute the validity of my story as to what I had said had taken place. And he didn't dispute it. Yet neither did he even have the courtesy to apologize to me personally, and I take it to neither to Srila Prabhupada, at least not publicly. By emailing him, I had given him an opportunity to apologize to Srila Prabhupada and us. But as far as I know, he did not do so, at least publicly. And neither did he dispute what I had said had happened. Rameshwar at the time, in 1999, was no longer active in ISKCON, and so I had no way of sending him an email. And also, I didn't have Satsarup's direct email at that time either, so I didn't send him one separately either. Before I complete this part of the story, however, I would like to say that it must have been around 2012 or 2013 that I was able to finally contact Rameshwar Prabhu, as he was at that time coming back into the association of ISKCON. I contacted him and brought up a number of topics, including this one. This was the main one, where I reminded him of how he and the other GBC men had lied to us using Srila Prabhupada's name at the time of Srila Prabhupada's departure. In my communication with him, I didn't even ask him for any kind of an apology. I simply told him how much his lying had affected me so strongly at the time, and that it took over 20 years for me to finally confront the trauma that it caused me. I will say here that to his credit, Rameshwar sent me a reply wherein he begged forgiveness for the offenses he had committed back in 1977 and during his Zono Acharya years later. However, he told me his memory of that period was not that good, and he really couldn't remember so much of the details, but he told me that he also did not dispute the details that I had shared with him. He admitted, however, he also knew that he had committed offenses at that time. And so he begged forgiveness. His apology seemed sincere and humble, and I will say again that it is to his credit, since I didn't even ask him for an apology. But should he ever view this presentation, I do pray that if he has not done so, he needs to offer his deepest apologies to Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada was actually the target of their lies. And it is my personal opinion that such apologies should be made fully public, since these men were public figures at that time, and their actions were public and offended virtually every disciple and follower of Srila Prabhupada at the time. For this reason, their apologies need to also be just as public, as well as privately, to Srila Prabhupada. Even devotees who weren't planning to go to be with Srila Prabhupada, many of them, if they had heard that Srila Prabhupada had requested that we all come to be with him, many would have gone right away. And others who may think they still probably wouldn't have gone, still, if they had seen hundreds and hundreds, and practically everybody was going, practically everybody would have gone. All of Srila Prabhupada's disciples would have gone. So yes, these lies by these men affected every single disciple of Srila Prabhupada, and therefore these same men need to apologize publicly to all of us. And if they can't, and if they don't, then the GBC as a body needs to apologize on behalf of those GBC members. I'm going to bring this now, part 4, to an end. And again, I thank you for staying with me. on my journey as I tell my story of my personal story on this topic. All right. Thank you, Hare Krishna. And when you're ready, go ahead and do number 5.